She was sentenced to die for burning her husband alive inside the very home where they had once vowed to grow old together. In the courtroom that day, there wasn't a single sympathetic glance, only the low murmur of gossip, the smirks of satisfaction, the cruel satisfaction of people convinced that justice had been served. They believed the story was over, that the monster would be executed, and the poor man she killed would finally rest in peace. But 1 year later, their world was turned upside down. While Laura Kane sat in a dark prison cell, counting down the days until her lethal injection, a man in Oregon swore he had just seen her husband Daniel Kane, alive, breathing, and walking hand in hand with another woman, down a sunlit street. If that's true, then what really happened on that horrific night, and who orchestrated it all? Brookhaven, Texas was the kind of place where people knew the sound of each other's trucks, the names of their dogs, and the way their neighbor's front porch light flickered in the rain. It wasn't a town built for secrets. Laura Kane had lived here all her life. At 33, she was known as polite, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who brought a casserole to a sick neighbor without being asked. She had married Daniel Kane when she was 29, and for a while, they looked like the picture-perfect couple. They'd bought a 2-story wooden house on the edge of town, the kind of place that looked like it belonged on a holiday postcard wide front porch, rocking chairs, the faint smell of cedar after a summer storm. But that postcard started to curl at the edges after Laura's father died. He left her a sizable inheritance enough to clear their mortgage, invest for the future, maybe even start the family she'd always wanted. At first, she thought the money would bring stability. Instead, it became the crack that splintered their marriage. Daniel's demeanor changed almost overnight. He insisted on managing the inheritance, saying it was best for their future. But it quickly became clear that management meant total control. He had the check deposited into a joint account, then quietly transferred it into separate investments under his name. Every dollar spent had to be explained. Every decision had to go through him. And then came the fights. They started as small arguments about grocery bills or gas receipts, but they grew louder, uglier. Soon the yelling spilled out of their home and into the ears of the neighbors. One evening, Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell from next door walked over after hearing what they later described as the kind of shouting that makes you think someone's going to get hurt. They found Daniel and Laura standing in the front yard, both red-faced, Laura's hands trembling, Daniel's voice cutting through the warm Texas night like a blade. "Go ahead," he spat at her. "One day you'll regret every damn word you say to me." The Mitchells tried to calm things down, but the tension was like a live wire. They eventually retreated, but not before Mrs. Mitchell caught something in Daniel's eyes, a cold, calculating look that didn't match the temper he was pretending to lose. The fights kept happening. Sometimes Laura would lock herself in the bedroom. Sometimes she'd get in her car and drive to her mother's house, staying the night just to avoid him. But the neighbors noticed something else more and more often. Daniel seemed to be the one provoking her, pressing her buttons, almost staging the arguments for an audience. What Laura didn't know, what nobody knew, was that every slammed door, every shouted threat, every night she fled to her mother's, was all part of a plan that had already begun to take shape in Daniel's mind. It was the kind of August night that makes the air feel heavy, like the whole town is holding its breath. Brookhaven was quiet, the streets nearly empty, except for the soft hum of cicadas in the trees. Around 11:45 p.m., Mrs. Mitchell next door was jolted awake by a strange popping sound like wood splitting. She sat up, confused, and then she saw it through her bedroom window, a faint orange flicker in the darkness, coming from the Kane house. By the time she stepped onto her porch, the flicker had become a living, breathing thing. Flames licked the curtains in the living room, curling upward as if reaching for the ceiling. The heat shimmered in the air, and the smell, sharp, chemical, unmistakable, hit her like a punch in the chest. She screamed for her husband, and together they ran toward the house. But the moment they reached the front yard, the heat drove them back. Somewhere inside, something exploded, maybe a window, maybe a piece of furniture, and shards of glass rained onto the lawn. Across the street, other neighbors began to appear, some barefoot, some clutching phones to their ears, calling 911. The fire moved fast, unnaturally fast, and in minutes it had consumed most of the ground floor. When the fire trucks arrived, the crew fought the blaze with brutal efficiency, dousing the walls, breaking down the front door, moving into the inferno with hoses and axes. But even from the street, the smoke was thick and black, curling into the sky like a warning. And then came the words that froze everyone in place. "There's a body." The firefighters emerged carrying what was left of a man, a body so burned that the features were gone, but a wedding band still clung to one charred hand. The fire chief, grim-faced, passed it to the coroner, who whispered something to the police officer beside him. That officer's eyes swept over the gathered neighbors, landing on the Mitchells. "Daniel," the officer said quietly, as if speaking it aloud would make it final. "It's Daniel Kane." In the chaos, someone asked where Laura was. The answer came from another neighbor. She'd seen Laura earlier that evening, leaving in her car, headed toward her mother's house 2 towns over. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. Why wasn't she home? Why hadn't she been there when the fire started? Why, when her husband was trapped inside their burning house? By 2 a.m., the street was still choked with emergency vehicles, the air still thick with the acrid stench of burnt wood and gasoline. And in the back of one of those police cruisers sat Laura Kane, pulled from her mother's front porch just hours later. She wore pajamas and no shoes, confusion etched into her face. She asked what was going on, why they were there. But the look in the detective's eyes said everything. "Laura," he told her, "we're taking you in for questioning." By sunrise, the fire was out, the street was empty, and the Kane house stood as a blackened shell. But in the police station, the case was already being framed. The narrative was too tempting, too neat. A wife inherits a fortune. Her marriage starts to crumble. The neighbors hear constant screaming matches, and now her husband is dead in a fire that experts say burned too hot, too fast to be accidental. Detective Alan Briggs laid it out on the table in the interrogation room, his tone flat, almost rehearsed. "You weren't home when your husband died," he began. "Witnesses say they've heard you threaten to burn the place down. You bought gasoline last week, and now we've got traces of accelerant at the scene." Laura stared at him, bewildered. "Gasoline? For the mower? And I was at my mother's." "Your mother doesn't remember exactly what time you arrived," Briggs cut in. "And we have a security camera less than a mile from your home showing your car near the property less than an hour before the fire." Laura's jaw tightened. She knew she hadn't been there. She also knew Daniel had a spare key to her car. But at that moment, none of that mattered. The narrative had locked into place. By the time the morning news aired, the story had gone public. Wife arrested in husband's fiery death. The anchor spoke in that careful tone reserved for the most salacious tragedies. They mentioned the inheritance, the fights, the insurance policy. The neighbors' quotes played on loop misses. Mitchell recounting that night she heard Laura shout she'd burn the whole place down. The prosecutor, Rick Holloway, saw his case gift-wrapped. He told reporters they'd be seeking the death penalty. This was calculated, cold-blooded murder. He declared Daniel Kane never had a chance. Inside the jail, Laura's world was shrinking. Her phone calls were monitored. Letters came from strangers, some calling her a monster, others offering prayers but always with a tone of pity. Even some of her own extended family began to keep their distance, afraid of the attention. When her lawyer, Ben Fletcher, visited, he brought little comfort. "Laura," he said, "I believe you, but they've built this like a wall. The fights, the inheritance, the so-called threats. It's all they need to sell this to a jury. Laura pressed her palms together on the table, the fluorescent light overhead making her skin look pale and tired. Ben, I didn't kill him. I wasn't even there. But outside that room, the town had already made up its mind. In their eyes, Laura Kane wasn't just guilty, she was the perfect suspect. The trial began 9 months after the fire, but in Brookhaven, it felt like the verdict had already been delivered long before the first gavel struck. For weeks leading up to it, the local news stations ran segments replaying footage of the burned Kane home, sound bites from neighbors, and graphics of Laura's inheritance as if it were Exhibit A. When Laura entered the courtroom on the first day, shackled at the wrists, the room went silent. It wasn't the respectful silence reserved for grief, it was the brittle quiet of people who had come to watch a show. Family members of Daniel sat in the front row, eyes hard, while reporters filled the back, pens poised over notepads. Prosecutor Rick Holloway wasted no time painting Laura as a calculating killer. He spoke with the confidence of a man certain he was telling the only possible version of the truth. This woman had motive, means, and opportunity. He told the jury she inherited a fortune, her marriage was collapsing, and she decided to solve her problems with gasoline and a match. The state's witnesses paraded in. Mrs. Mitchell, in a pressed floral dress, recounted the nights of shouting, the threats she claimed to have overheard. I remember her saying she'd burn that house to the ground, she said, glancing toward the jury with practiced sorrow. An arson expert testified that the fire burned in a pattern consistent with the use of accelerants, and lab results confirmed gasoline traces. Surveillance footage, grainy and dark, showed what prosecutors claimed was Laura's car driving past a street near her home less than an hour before the fire started. Every detail Holloway presented built upon the last, a neatly stacked tower of circumstantial evidence that looked, from the outside, like a fortress. Laura's defense, led by Ben Fletcher, was fragile in comparison. He argued that she had been at her mother's house that night and had no reason to harm Daniel. He suggested the gasoline purchase was for routine yard work and pointed out the unreliability of grainy surveillance footage. But the blows kept coming. Her mother's testimony wavered under cross-examination. She couldn't swear to the exact time Laura arrived that night. The prosecutor leaned on that uncertainty like a wedge, splitting the defense's narrative wide open. When Laura took the stand, her voice trembled but didn't break. She told the jury she loved her husband once, that she had wanted to fix things, not end them. I didn't kill him, she said, meeting their eyes one by one. I wasn't even there. Her words landed in a courtroom already sealed shut with doubt. It took the jury just 5 hours to return with a verdict guilty of capital murder. Laura stood as the judge read her sentence, death by lethal injection. A few people in the gallery actually smiled. One man whispered, "Justice." Laura didn't cry, she didn't plead. She just looked straight at the prosecutor and said, "If he's dead, where's your proof I was there?" The bailiff led her away, the sound of chains dragging against the tile floor echoing long after the courtroom emptied. 1 year after Laura Kane was sentenced to die, Brookhaven had nearly moved on. The charred remains of the Kane house had been torn down, replaced by a vacant lot overgrown with weeds. Laura's name still came up sometimes in hushed tones at the grocery store, in the bitter comment sections of local news sites, but most people believed her story was over. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon in Salem, Oregon, everything changed. Mark Ellison, a delivery driver, was on his lunch break, carrying a grocery bag back to his car when he froze mid-step. Across the street, walking out of a hardware store, was a man he hadn't seen in nearly a decade, but one he'd know anywhere. Daniel Kane. Mark had gone to high school with Daniel back in Texas. They'd played on the same baseball team, gotten into trouble for skipping classes together. The hair was a little longer now, and there was a beard, but the way he moved, the posture, The half-smirk as he spoke to the woman beside him, it was unmistakable. And it wasn't just the woman. It was how Daniel looked at her, easy, relaxed, as if life had never handed him the kind of tragedy that made headlines back home. Mark pulled out his phone. The first photo came out blurry, so he took another, zooming in on the man's face. Then he sent both to a mutual friend in Texas with one line, "Tell me this isn't Daniel Kane." Within hours, those photos landed on the desk of an editor at the Salem Chronicle. The paper called the local police, who ran the man's face through a database. The match came back in seconds: fingerprint records, an old driver's license photo. It was him. Daniel Kane, declared dead in a Texas house fire, was alive and well in Oregon, living under the name David Cross. He had a rental apartment, a job with a small delivery company, and a bank account that had seen several large cash deposits in the past year. The total, just over the amount Laura had inherited before the fire. When the news broke, it tore through the media like a brush fire. Dead man walking husband in murder case found alive. Cable networks sent vans to Brookhaven. Reporters stood outside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, demanding answers. Outside the prison gates, Laura's mother held a press conference with Ben Fletcher at her side. "My daughter is innocent," she told the cameras. "This is the proof. You have to let her go." Social media exploded with outrage. Hashtags calling for Laura's release trended nationwide. Commentators on every network debated how the justice system could condemn a woman for killing a man who was still breathing. The pressure worked. Within a week, the Texas Attorney General announced a special task force to reopen the investigation. Detectives flew to Oregon, working with local authorities to put Daniel Kane under surveillance. Cameras captured him leaving his apartment, holding hands with the same woman from the photos, a brunette in her late 20s, smiling up at him like they'd known each other forever. And then came the moment that sent a shiver through every investigator on the case when Daniel was finally taken into custody outside his building. One reporter shouted over the noise of the crowd, "Did you frame your wife, Daniel?" Daniel turned, met the camera lens, and smiled a slow, thin smile before ducking into the back of the police car. At first, Daniel Kane said nothing. He sat in the interrogation room in Oregon with his arms crossed, his lawyer beside him, letting the silence stretch until it became a wall. The Texas detectives who had flown in to question him could see it. He was enjoying this. But that wall began to crack when they laid out the evidence: the fingerprint match, the bank deposits, the rental agreements, the employment records under a fake name. Daniel's smirk faded, and after a glance at his attorney, he began to talk. Not all of it, not in order, but enough for the picture to emerge. The beginning of the plan, according to Daniel, came before Laura's father even died. He had been seeing another woman for months, a brunette named Emily Carver, someone he'd met through a mutual friend at a hardware store. What started as an affair became an obsession, and together they began imagining a life far from Brookhaven. The only obstacle, money. When Laura's father passed and left her a substantial inheritance, Daniel saw his opening. Step one was reputation. He needed Laura to look like the kind of person capable of violence, so he provoked her carefully, strategically. Late-night arguments with the windows open, yelling matches on the front lawn, threats pulled out of her in moments of frustration, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Every outburst was another brick in the wall he was building around her. Step two was the frame. A week before the fire, Daniel took Laura's car without her knowledge. Late at night, wearing a hooded jacket. He drove past a street near their home where he knew a security camera was mounted. The footage would later show a vehicle matching hers passing the area not long before the fire, a subtle but devastating piece of evidence. Step three was the body. Daniel's voice lowered when he described this part, but there was no trace of remorse. A few days before the fire, he'd driven into a part of town known as the Strip, a stretch of broken pavement and flickering neon where addicts and drifters lived in the shadows. There, he came across a man slumped in an alley, not breathing, a used syringe still between his fingers. He checked for a pulse. Nothing. The man was gone, likely from an overdose. Daniel looked around. No one was watching, and in that moment, the last piece of his plan slid into place. He loaded the body into the trunk of Laura's car and drove it home. The next nights were spent moving certain pieces of furniture, placing items in the living room that could be traced to him, and, most importantly, slipping his own wedding band onto the stiffening finger of the dead man. On the night of the fire, Daniel waited until Laura was at her mother's house. Then he and Emily carried out the final act. Gasoline was poured across the floors and furniture, pooling around the body in the living room. A single match turned the house into an inferno within minutes. By the time the neighbors saw the flames, Daniel and Emily were already miles away, driving west with the inheritance money cash he had withdrawn in the days before the fire, broken into smaller amounts to avoid suspicion. In Oregon, they set up a new life, new names, new jobs, new apartment. Daniel claimed he would have stayed gone forever if not for the bad luck of running into someone from high school. Detective Briggs, who had once interrogated Laura, listened to this confession with a sick weight in his stomach. "You didn't just run away," he told Daniel. "You built a trap. You made her the bait." Daniel didn't answer, but the faint smirk returned to his face as if, even now, he thought he'd been clever. The day Daniel Kane's confession hit the news, the narrative flipped overnight. For a year, Laura Kane had been the Black Widow of Brookhaven, the cold-blooded wife who burned her husband alive for money. Now, she was something else entirely, the face of one of the worst wrongful convictions in Texas history. News networks ran wall-to-wall coverage. The same anchors who had once spoken her name with disdain now introduced her as the woman who was sentenced to die for a crime that never happened. Satellite trucks crowded outside the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Protesters gathered with signs reading "Free Laura Kane" and "Justice for the Innocent." Laura's mother, who had endured a year of whispered accusations and veiled pity, stood in front of a bank of microphones with attorney Ben Fletcher at her side. "You stole my daughter's life," she told the cameras, her voice breaking. "Now you give it back." The pressure was too great to ignore. Within days, the Texas Attorney General's office petitioned the state's highest criminal court to vacate Laura's conviction. In a rare move, the court convened an emergency hearing. Laura was brought into the courtroom in shackles, but this time the atmosphere was different. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens ready. Members of the public, some of whom had once cheered her sentence, sat in tense silence. The evidence was laid out: Daniel's living presence in Oregon, the financial trail from Laura's inheritance into his accounts, his confession about the overdose victim used to fake his death. When the presiding judge finally spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath. "The court finds," he said, "that Laura Kane has been wrongfully convicted of capital murder and is hereby fully exonerated." It took a moment for the words to land. Laura's mother wept openly. Ben Fletcher squeezed Laura's shoulder, and Laura herself, after a year in the shadow of death, closed her eyes, as if bracing for the impact of freedom. She walked out of the courthouse later that day a free woman. The state's governor issued a formal, televised apology. "On behalf of the state of Texas, we recognize the grievous mistake made in this case, and we apologize to Laura Kane and her family for the suffering she has endured." Laura was awarded a multi-million-dollar settlement for her wrongful imprisonment. Part of that money, she announced, would fund a legal aid foundation for others facing wrongful convictions. But even as she smiled for the cameras, there was a shadow behind her eyes. Freedom did not erase the years she'd spent under the sentence of death, or the betrayal that had put her there. Meanwhile, prosecutors prepared a new case, this time against Daniel. He was charged with first-degree murder for the death of the overdose victim, along with fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Emily Carver, his lover, was arrested and charged as an accomplice. The same public that had once condemned Laura now demanded the harshest possible punishment for the man who framed her. And in the middle of it all, Laura gave one statement that became a headline across the country. "You stole my life, but you didn't take my voice." Daniel Kane's trial drew almost as much attention as Laura's had. This time, the roles were reversed. The former widower sat at the defense table, shackled and stone-faced, while prosecutors laid out the cruelty and precision of his plan. The jury saw the photos of the overdose victim he had used as a stand-in for his own body. They followed the money trail from Laura's inheritance into Daniel's secret accounts. They heard Emily Carver testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, describing the night they set the fire and fled Texas. It took the jury less than 3 days to convict him on all counts: first-degree murder, fraud, theft, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Emily Carver received a 15-year sentence for her role. She cried in court, but the tears did little to soften public opinion. For most people, she was as complicit as Daniel, a willing architect in a scheme that nearly killed an innocent woman. For Laura, freedom was not the same as peace. She moved away from Brookhaven, settling in a city where she could walk the streets without feeling every pair of eyes on her. She used part of her settlement to create the Kane Foundation, dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted individuals fight their cases. Her first public event drew national media coverage not for the cameras, but because she stood at the podium, steady and composed, using her own voice to push for change in the system that had failed her. Still, the scars were there. She spoke openly about the nightmares, the sound of the cell door slamming, the cold of the death chamber, the weight of knowing the state planned to kill her. She never said Daniel's name in interviews. The case left its mark on Texas law. Lawmakers passed new legislation requiring a review of all death row cases when new evidence of innocence emerged. Training for prosecutors and investigators was overhauled, with the Kane case used as a mandatory study. In Brookhaven, the lot where the Kane house once stood remained empty. Weeds grew high, and no one seemed eager to build there. The neighbors avoided talking about it, though some admitted they still felt a chill when they passed the corner at night. A year to the day after her release, Laura returned quietly to the Gulf Coast. She walked along the shoreline at sunset, the water glowing orange under the fading light. In her hand, she held 2 rings, her own wedding band and the charred band that had once been used to identify Daniel's body. She stood for a moment, staring at them, then let them fall into the waves. The tide took them quickly, swallowing the metal whole. A voiceover could have ended it right there, but if you'd been standing beside her, you might have heard the words she whispered to the ocean. Some flames destroy, others reveal the truth. For me, both happened on the same night.